Welcome, my name is Nicole Naditz, and today we're going to talk about checking for understanding. Just like last time, this lesson is based on both an infographic, which you see in front of you, and an overview article written by Helena Curtin and Alyssa Villarreal. And that overview article is also located in your resources in Canvas. So today we're going to have an overview to checking for understanding and its role in the language classroom today. We're going to just start right away with what it is. Checking for understanding is a series of activities that we do as teachers. We purposefully plan for them, and they create a picture of learning so that teachers are aware of what students have learned and so that teachers can make any changes necessary in order to increase student understanding. So that kind of brings us right to some of the reasons why we do checks for understanding. If we just plow through our lesson and keep on teaching and keep on providing new words, new phrases, new structures without checking for understanding, we aren't going to know what the students have learned. Similarly, the checking for understanding actually helps us, therefore, identify misconceptions or misunderstandings that the students are having and that are interfering with their learning. And finally, checking for understanding provides learners with a model of good learning skills. We want learners to actually check their own understanding and their progress, not just in our classes, but in all of their classes. So some of the things to consider when checking for understanding are kind of listed in this checklist. How often are you checking? Well, it turns out we need to be checking pretty frequently. It's not enough to just check for understanding once in a 55-minute period. We shouldn't even be designing a series of comprehensible input that takes 55 minutes. But if we are going to do that, we need to check in an ongoing way, frequently, and using a variety of different types of checks for understanding, which we'll hear about today. Another thing to consider is whether or not students have to produce language in order to demonstrate understanding. Because when they are learning new content, they actually need to have multiple opportunities to receive input before we can ask them to produce that new content. As a result, we want to start our checks for understanding with nonverbal checks and then proceed and progress to different kinds of checks for understanding where the students will actually write or speak in the language in order to demonstrate their understanding. We also want to be sure that the way the students demonstrate their understanding is aligned to the targeted proficiency level. This comes in two forms. One is how we structure the checks for understanding and make sure we structure checks that give us the responses at the targeted range of proficiency. And the other is just looking at what the students give us back. For example, if we targeted a novice high range of proficiency, which should be starting to respond in some complete sentences, and the student is just responding with isolated words, we need to see if we need to modify the task so that the student has to answer in a complete sentence, or if the student is not capable of providing a complete sentence and therefore isn't functioning at novice high yet. And finally, we want to look at what it is that we as teachers do with the checks for understanding once the students have completed them. How are they informing what I do right there on the spot with students or groups of students, what I'm going to do the next day or over the next week, and how will I approach teaching this same content next year to a new group of students based on what I'm learning today. So when teachers regularly check for understanding, students also become increasingly aware of how to monitor their own understanding. This actually helps them be much more successful in their learning in all classes, and it helps them take more responsibility for their learning and recognize that their active involvement in this entire process really does benefit them. So every check for understanding is actually a formative assessment. And as you'll see in a minute, some of them even can progress to the level of performance assessment, not the first time they do it, but some of them mimic the way in which the students will actually engage in performance assessment when they are ready to demonstrate their learning in a more formal way. So we're going to start by looking at some nonverbal strategies for checking for understanding, because again, we want to start with nonverbal so that students show us they understand before they're required to produce. And one of the nonverbal types of checks for understanding is a finger hold up, where they signal their comprehension by holding up a designated finger. This would have to be dependent on what is culturally appropriate, but in American culture, as well as in French speaking cultures, students can hold up a thumbs up to signify that they are doing well or understand completely, thumb to the side to show that their comprehension is so-so, or they need a little help, or thumbs down if they really don't understand or need a lot of help. A variation on doing finger holdups would be to have printed response cards that might say a variety of phrases, or that might be specific answers for a particular theme of instruction, or even just colored cards or simply pictures. So, for example, you could give each student a little set of a green card, a yellow card, and a red card, and they can hold up the card based on your instructions, whether it's a red card means I don't understand well, or whether it is a red card means this is a fruit and a green card means this is a vegetable. But we can use those colored cards, or we can give students pictures and students hold up the picture to show that they understand. In all of these cases, they don't need to use any language in order to show us their understanding. Electronic response devices and tools help us get a very quick view of the whole class's demonstration of understanding and comprehension, as long as we do a good job crafting the activities and the types of questions we're going to ask. Most commonly now, students respond with a class set of iPads or a class set of Chromebooks, or using their own phones, and teachers go to an online tool where they can design the checks for understanding or the formative assessments. The students simply put in their answers, and then it provides immediate data that we can act upon. Another type of nonverbal checking for understanding would be drawing pictures. I would not include writing words at this point, because if they have to write language, it's actually verbal. But if they can draw pictures, that actually gives us a way of seeing that they understand without them having to say or spell or write anything. I love using whiteboards in this way, and so I had a class set of whiteboards that I could ask questions. My students quickly drew their answer, or later when they were ready for the verbal checks for understanding, they would write their answers and hold it up, and I could immediately see who needed help, who's got it, whether I needed to reteach a concept for the whole class, or whether I needed to work with a small group of individuals. Another type of non-verbal check for understanding that tells me that my students understand without my students having to produce language is to simply act out what it is that I am asking for. So if this is really good, like with action verbs or emotions, the teacher says something like eat, and the students actually act out eating, but they don't have to say anything, and I know that they understand. You may want to have them close their eyes, because that way they all respond, but they can't see each other's responses, and they feel a little less concerned about them doing the wrong action in front of their peers, and you still get all of the information that you need. Another nonverbal check for understanding is sequencing pictures. So you can actually give students a set of pictures pre-printed on paper. They listen to you, and they put the pictures in the order in which you say them in a story or whatever context it is you're doing. Or you could also put pictures up on a wall and give students other pictures and ask them to categorize themselves. For example, fruits and vegetables, and have them move to the correct picture, which would be a type of sequencing pictures. You see here that they can do written descriptions. We're going to talk about that in a minute, because we are now moving over to the verbal strategies for checking for understanding. So remember what I said, we want to do many different ways of checking for understanding. We want to start with nonverbal, but we definitely want to progress to verbal strategies as well. So some of those verbal strategies include simple questioning. And you'll remember back in our opening module, we talked about the sequence of questions that is the most successful. You don't want to just ask one question. You want to start with yes, no, which requires very little language on the student's part, or true, false. Move to either or. So now you hold up an apple and you ask, and you ask them, is this an apple or an orange? And they say apple. And then lastly, you do the who, what, when, where, why type of questions, where students have to produce a little bit more language. Another verbal check for understanding comes back to what we said with sequencing pictures. Once the students have done that nonverbal piece, they can actually write or tell the sequence in the target language as a second check for understanding. You can do exit and entrance slips to get information about what students already know about a topic, or to ask a question that causes them to have to reuse an older piece of information they learned because that word or that structure is important for today's lesson. And similarly, you can use an exit slip where the students self-evaluate. I can do this by myself. I don't need any help. I can only do this with help, or I can't do this at all yet. Or you can do an exit slip that asks them to do something with the new language to give you information. Summarizing strategies are great. There's a lot of ways to do them. We don't have time to talk about them all today, but essentially they involve having students use the language to summarize the story they listened to, the article they read, or just the lesson in general. And you can even then have other students summarize each other so that they're doing multiple summaries. Lineups, initially a lineup might be like sequencing and it might be nonverbal, but this lineup is different. This lineup is having two lines of students facing each other, and one line is going to ask questions and the other line is going to answer. And what I like to do is actually have the class brainstorm with me all of the questions we know how to ask about a topic, and then they all choose which question from that list they'd like to ask. That way they're practicing a little bit of spontaneous communication, because as this student moves to the next person in line, so now this is a new student, they don't know which question they're going to be asked, but they do know that it's going to come from that list of questions that we brainstormed together. Another way this works is with two circles facing each other, an inside circle and an outside circle. So that basically brings us to the end of our overview of checking for understanding. The important piece to remember here is that it is a critical part of lesson design that we have to plan for, and we have to include multiple checks for understanding that start with nonverbal and progress to verbal, so that we know if our students are with us and we have a pulse on what's happening in our classes. Thanks again.